Halo Combat Evolved is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year, and 343 Industries, who are now stewards of the Halo franchise, are keeping to that festive mood and are updating the Halo Master Chief Collection on PC and Xbox consoles. Key updates are promised as a part of Season 7, with, most importantly, updates to the first Halo game. To talk about these updates today, I'm joined by Adam Taylor, also known as Epos Vox. How you doing there, Adam?
Doing all right. How about you?
I'm pretty all right. This is an interesting thing here because usually I would be talking to something like Halo with John Linneman, my friend and colleague. But today I've brought in Adam because he knows quite a lot about Halo himself. He's been playing the game for years, probably just as long as we all have, and also kind of has a good technical understanding of the game. So Adam, what is your experience actually with the Halo franchise?
I go back to Halo on the PC days. I didn't get into it on Xbox for a little while later just because I didn't have access, but pretty much straight away in 2003, Halo on PC was the way that I played it. And so it's always been interesting talking about these visual changes because that's the version that I am native to, whereas I didn't see a lot of those fancy shaders and stuff until quite a few years later.
Yeah, that must have been pretty interesting because I originally started playing this game on the Xbox way back when and only played the Halo PC port in 2003 and on a PC that probably could not deal with it. So I never really got that Halo CE PC experience so much. But that's a good way to introduce this all. Let's get actually into what we're going to be talking about here today, which is the Season 7 update and specifically how it applies to Halo Combat Evolved. I don't know, Adam, could you give me an introduction of essentially what starting point we're at and what the promise is here with the Season 7 update?
Well, they have made some minor fixes over the past 6 years that Master Chief Collection has been out. The Master Chief Collection has been entirely built around the PC versions of the first two Halo games because that was the easiest way for them to port it to the Xbox 360 and the Xbox One and things like that. And so that comes with the shader downgrades, a couple weird character model replacements, and a few other tweaks that Gearbox, the original developer that ported the game to PC, had to make in compromises to run it on a PC. And so unfortunately, we have spent the past, it's been almost 18 years now, with all of these all of these downgrades being kind of iterated upon and stacked upon. And so we're finally getting a lot of those kind of brought back because there's been a big community outcry to be like, hey, we want the original effects. We want Halo to look the best it can, especially since this version is also on Xbox. So you don't get the Xbox effects on Xbox, you get the PC effects on every platform.
Yeah, that was always a big shame, and I made a big deal about it in my first video covering Halo Combat Evolved in the Master Chief Collection on PC here. And today, we're going to be going through some of the changes that we were able to see in the Season 7 flight preview that came out. So not every single change can be looked at, but a majority of them. And I think first we should start with the issue of fog. Essentially, when you would look on levels like on Assault in the control room, and you look at the sky, you would see kind of like a hole in the sky as the fog ramping, as it might be called, was not working correctly. And you could see like the outline edges of the geometry. And immediately, the first thing that you can see in this comparison footage right here is that it is now completely fixed, which is rather awesome, and this will help out a lot of levels in the game.
Especially leading into 343 Guilty Spark, which is the first introduction to the Flood. That entire level was meant to be this dark and moody and you can't see what's going on around you kind of level with a lot of fog, not only in the distance, but close to the camera. You're supposed to literally be walking through fog, and that wasn't present on PC or in the Master Chief Collection. And that aesthetic has been restored with this effect, so where for the most part, it looks identical to the Xbox, which is really nice because that really hurt the mood that they were going for.
Yeah, it really did. And I think that kind of ties into the rest of the effects differences on top of like the fog and things like that, where now you also have Jackal shields being done quite differently. The original game had it when you would shoot the Jackal shield that you could see the texture change in its color and also the effect on it with like kind of moving around and adding some noise in. The original game had a completely, in the Master Chief Collection, had a completely different texture in the first place and didn't even do any of this changing behavior. Now, though, as a part of Season 7, we're actually getting that Jackal Shield effect back, just like it was back then, and in high resolution, too. So it's rather awesome looking. I'm actually pretty surprised that they were able to bring this back.
I was very impressed with it just because the original texture that they were using looked so low resolution. Even scaling up the original Xbox footage compared to it, even the lower resolution capture still looks so much better. So this is really nice. And as a workaround on PC, effectively just kind of added in different colored shields to make it look like there was a variety rather than the damage model. So it's nice to see that this is more unified, and it's a really cool effect, like especially for the time. I'm glad to see it.
Yeah, there's a number of these transparent, moving, ethereal, like lightning effects in the game. And another one that you can see is on the Covenant Energy Shield, which has that exact same fix and style as the Jackal Shield. So that's another great fix that we see in there. And one that is a little bit rarer to see in the single player campaign, but more often in multiplayer levels, are the teleporters, which on the original Gearbox PC version had a very different looking texture on them and effect. And now, as we can see here in the side-by-sides, the shader effect and material is the same, thankfully.
It's the same, it's dynamic, it's actually moving around, and it has that translucence to it, so you can see the electronics going on behind that are supposed to represent what's powering the teleporter. The only issue is it's lacking the Xbox's light map. So on the original Xbox, you had this nice, it looked, I mean, obviously it's not, global illumination or anything, but it looked like the teleporter was casting this bright green light into the room, and it's amazing. And you almost have less of that now because it still has the older light map, which is a lot less green in the space. But since the texture for the teleporter itself is actually a little bit less bright, you almost have a little bit less glow. Even though the teleporter itself is more accurate, the room is less lit by it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I do wonder if, as a part of this, they may need to or may want to rebuild the game's light maps.
Right.
So that I don't know how possible that is necessarily, but that is one thing that could maybe fix something like that, the different level of glow on that teleporter there. Other kind of glow effects here is you have this plasma lightning effect, I'm going to call it, on the sky of the dome here in Assault on the Control Room. That's also correct now. It wasn't that big of a difference in general anyway, because it was just in the corner there as you look up. It's not like something that was actually directly affecting most gameplay visuals or views, but I think it goes to show the totality of these changes here. And they must have had some sort of systemic way of adding in all these changes, because some of these are very small, actually.
Including the light sources, not only on this map, but multiplayer maps as well. There's a lot of lights throughout, I guess, the entirety of the game that are supposed to flicker. You wouldn't, like someone like me who played the PC version originally, you don't necessarily miss it if you don't know that it's supposed to be there, but then seeing it added back in just adds that extra level of dynamic, feeling to the maps. And that's present both on the Assault to the Control Room lights, as we can show here, as well as quite a few multiplayer lights. They have these lights just kind of scattered throughout, and they all have a flicker. I don't know why every fluorescent light on the entire Halo ring is damaged, but that's what they went for.
The Forerunners had great aesthetics, not necessarily great electrical, skills. But kind of another thing that was going through here that they also changed, and I think this is less applicable to the single-player campaign because you don't actually get this weapon there at any point in time, but the fuel rod cannon in multiplayer now actually is using the proper sound effect. Originally, like you can hear here, it was using the Anniversary Edition sound effects, which is very different, not within the style necessarily of the original fuel rod cannon effect that you can hear and see grunts shooting in the last mission of the campaign. But now it's correct, and it sounds all right.
And this is not a complete fix overall. There are still some complaints about specific cutscenes and various scenarios that still have the anniversary sound effects sprinkled in. And this is a side effect of the fact that when you launch Halo in the Master Chief Collection, you can't just boot Combat Evolved, the original game. You're booting this fusion of the anniversary updates and the classic engine running side by side. And so this paired with, there's extra lines in certain cutscenes that come from the anniversary that they added in that you can't just cut out of the classic edition because you're running them at the same time, especially for multiplayer where you only have the classic version. Having those original sounds restored is really nice.
Yeah, it's nice to see that kind of like dedication here to actually get things right. Maybe some of those other fixes in the future, maybe not possible due to the way the original game was set up in terms of switching on and off the graphics immediately, but I do really like this. Another big difference in the original 2003 Gearbox release as well that the MCC took over was changes in textures. There was the kind of improper usage of bump mapping where bump maps wouldn't show up all the time or textures would just be completely different. Now we can't go through the entire game here and say which ones are fixed now and which ones aren't because there's a limited amount that we can check out in this flight preview here, but we did get a look at a couple of them, and one of them specifically was in the Pillar of Autumn here. In one of the initial sections of the game, you're kind of tasked to go in to this dark corridor and turn on your flashlight. And in the Gearbox version and the MCC, the textures in this area they almost looked unfinished. For some reason, they decided not use any of the ones with the bump map and the specular sheen and just the general higher density. In the new version, though, as part of Halo Combat Evolved Season 7 here, it looks exactly like the original Halo game. I mean, there may be slight differences, though, in the way maybe the flashlight lights up the area. I'm not exactly positive about that, but at least the texture here is completely correct now.
And it still casts a light down the hallway, which turns this little section, which was really just to introduce you to the Duke controller and the white button on it to activate the flashlight, to be like, hey, we have a flashlight button. And it turned it into more of like a jump scare kind of room. And so there were lots of memes made from this that I'm glad it's kind of restored, because it got really creepy, which was out of place.
Und? Yeah, I kind of love that they introduce you to the game mechanic like that. I always got this kind of Half-Life vibe from playing the first Halo as a result of that, where they diegetically show you how to use everything in the game world. Very cool. Such a great game. Another texture difference as part of this upgrading of the bump maps is that a lot of the door structure areas in the Forerunner areas of the game, they all use this very standard texture and door setup, now look to have proper bump maps to them, and they have a different look altogether in the Season 7 shot. Much more closely resembling what we can see on Halo Combat Evolved on the original Xbox. Obviously, though, at a much higher resolution.
Right. It looks like a completely different game. The flatness that you got originally dated the game way more than it actually looked. And this, it looks so much better. Yeah. And one little detail that you would never probably notice was missing, but you notice when it's back, is the health packs have a light on them now, both in multiplayer and campaign. They just the red cross just sits there and glows red and then turns off and over, and that has been missing since 2003.
That's awesome. You know, I'm actually a little surprised that they keep that red health cross on there, because if I recall correctly, when they updated Doom and Doom 2, they re-brought out those WADs for things like Xbox 360 back in the day, and even the new versions you can play now as part of Doom 3 BFG or any of the other releases, they got rid of the red cross on the item, essentially, in the game of all the health packs, because it's copyrighted by the International Red Cross. But for some reason, Halo doesn't care about copyrights.
I've always wondered about that.
But yeah, some other fixes in here. The original version of MCC and the Gearbox port, for some reason, and all the cutscenes containing Captain Keyes or even his gameplay model used the beta version of that model, which had different textures, lower resolution textures, and also slightly different geometry. Now, though, it's brought back exactly like it should be, as you see on the original Xbox, which, of course, having a proper character model is very much so appreciated.
And you can tell the whole lighting in this scene feels better. He's so much more brighter and warmer, and they've de-aged him like 10 years. It looks more correct and looks so much better.
As another part of the scene, like here when we're looking at Keyes, you get actually down to the bottom part at the front of the ship, and you look out the window. In the original version on the MCC, you can see that you can barely see the star field and even not really see the rings so well behind the glass, as the glass is for some reason not shading the things behind it correctly, or it is tinting the things behind it correctly. But now in Halo Master Chief Collection Season 7 here, it is fixed and much more resembles that which we find in the original Xbox version. And this applies to, I think, all glass materials in the game that at least use this material. So the cryostasis pod that the Chief hops out in earlier in this part of the mission looks correct. And also the glass in that first part of that cutscene, it always looked so odd in the MCC version and the Gearbox original, because it like over darkened every single area in the little hangar behind it. You couldn't even see the detail in there. But now in the Season 7 version of that is looking all completely correct.
And for those who have maybe not looked at it since Master Chief launched, Master Chief no longer climbs out of a shell of his former self. That was a weird bug that
Yes.
thankfully they have since fixed, but that was interesting.
Master Chief Collection is a massive project. The fact that it has bugs does not surprise me, but it was always such a shame to see large bugs in the front frame of the picture right when you start the game. That always is not always the best of signs. One thing that you might have noticed when watching this footage, still in spite of all these great changes that we've seen so far as part of this, and we're not showing them all right now due to the kind of, once again, limited nature of what you can check out in one of these preview flights, but the general color tone of the images in comparison to the original Xbox and what you see even in Season 7 is, slightly different. I'm not sure exactly why that is the case. It could just be some very specific gamma or color settings or even texture settings that the original Xbox has that are different from modern PCs or modern GPUs used in the Xbox games. But the game has a slightly darker, more saturated and bloomy tone in the original Xbox version that doesn't always carry across to every image that we see here in the MCC.
It's honestly a little confusing because a lot of the time when we go back to games that were built for CRTs, which have a little bit more depth in their display, the games modernized end up looking more washed out in presentation, but we almost get the opposite because the older game is what is more saturated and moody and bloomy. And it's really, you most strongly notice it in when you're holding weapons like the plasma rifle or the plasma pistol, because there's just this extra little, it's super subtle, but you can really there's just a little bit of extra glow and bloom to everything that looks a little bit nicer. And there are specific scenarios where they hand placed some of that back in, like some of the lights we looked at that were flickering, they bloom a little bit more, but the overall image itself is still a little bit more washed out. And honestly, that could probably come down to some sort of color space conversion or something else.
Yep.
But this is another thing that goes back to the original PC port, so I don't know what would require to really tweak that, and diminishing returns, I guess. But
yeah, if I do recall, the Halo 2 originally as part of the MCC launched with being, I guess, gamma incorrect and kind of washing out the entire image because that's what the original PC version had. So maybe it's something along those lines, but it's really hard to tell. Another part of my review back in the day of Halo CE on PC focused on animation or frame rate interpolation because it was a part of bringing this game, Halo Combat Evolved, up to 60 FPS, required interpolating a lot of the game's animations because they had a hard keyframed set to 30. So a lot of the character animations, a lot of the world update, a lot of everything other than the screen movement usually. So game mods for the original Gearbox version have fixed this over the years to a great degree of detail, but I found the original Halo MCC release on PC and both on Xbox lacking in certain details. So we're going to get into some of those changes now that have occurred since at least the game is launched. So one thing you might have noticed earlier when you were looking at Season 6 and Season 7 cutscenes moving side by side is that you can see that the character models in cutscenes no longer do this weird jitter step where it almost looks like they exist in two frames at once. That's the problem with the original code, was the character models, as they would move with the camera moving, would still update at 30 FPS, even though they would like turn at 60 FPS and do things like that. But now looking at Season 7, all the characters in cutscenes, regardless of frame rate, 60 and above, are going to be moving at proper speed and not kind of look like they're jittering in that weird way.
my favorite example of this is on, again, Assault on the Control Room. This is one of the bigger missions to show things, is the elite with the sword. It was a really big moment for the game because it was such a cool thing that they didn't let you access until the second game. For whatever reason, in the original Master Chief release, his sword model and the plasma effects attached to the sword model move at different frame rates. So when they did the interpolation, they were out of sync. So he would move, his sword would move, and then the particles would still be back one frame. And it's just this really jarring, like immersion breaking bug that is thankfully super smooth and easy to watch and not notice now.
It looks quite a bit better. And I guess, though, there was only I would say limitations to essentially what they've fixed since the release.
Right.
There were a number of other kind of, I would say, animations that were kept at 30 FPS in the original Halo MCC and look to be more or less the same right now. So energy weapon discharges, like plasma weapon shots moving through the midair, whether they're from stationary plasma guns or from your own, still seem to be moving at 30 FPS, regardless of your frame rate. This is one thing that the interpolation mod, the Gearbox original, does fix. So I'm hoping that 343 could perhaps look to fix this as the year goes along.
I will say that with all of the other animations being updated and with so many showing at 60 FPS and feeling a lot smoother, that for example, the plasma turret in the background being 30 FPS looks much less distracting. You would think it would be the opposite, but when the whole scene is moving at 60 FPS, it just looks like there's more space in between the shots than you might think there should be, but it's not as, like in the original clips, it looks super choppy and it looks a little smoother, even though if you go frame by frame, it's still the same frame rate. Just everything else is moving at the right frame rate now, so it's a little more obscured at least.
Yeah, and there's other more obscure things that don't update at 60, like, and these aren't necessarily very important, like the antenna on the Warthog or the Scorpion tank still look to move at 30 FPS. And I guess one of the ones that is almost hidden, because you wouldn't really notice it until you've seen it move smoothly, is when the game has any screen shake occur, like when you fire the rocket launcher. That always moved at 30 FPS until a very later version of the interpolation mods on PC. So this still moves at 30 FPS in the Halo Master Chief Collection as of Season 7 preview right now. And it is fixable, but once again, this is definitely not distracting. It's just one of the things that my weird eyes tend to notice. Coming to the end here of all of these changes, I think, based upon what I've seen so far and all the awesome footage that you've collected here, by the way, Adam, because I'm just talking in this video. You're the one who actually did to prime all the work here, and we're very grateful for that. I think this is awesome. I really think Halo Combat Evolved is such an important game for the history of video games, for the history of Microsoft, and for the history of first-person shooters and graphics tech. You were mentioning it earlier where you saw Halo in that Gearbox version without all these fancy quote-unquote shader effects that really defined the game's look when it came out. And we haven't had any access to that essentially since the original Xbox time period.
What's really interesting is I remember a specific moment very vividly, and this is at least 10 years ago now. I was still in high school when Combat Evolve Anniversary first dropped, and we were doing, my buddies and I were putting in, because Xbox 360 had back compat for Halo on the Xbox.
Oh, yeah.
We were putting in Halo and then putting in Anniversary and then doing the back and forth between the graphics engines. And at the time, I wasn't looking for the right things and I wasn't experienced enough to know what was wrong. But every time I was like, this isn't right. The lighting isn't right. Something, they're making the old game look worse to make the new one look better or something. Like I could tell something wasn't quite right, but I didn't have a clue what I was talking about, and everyone thought I was crazy, and so I thought I was crazy. And then we're getting to see all of this put back, and I'm like, yes, it looks like it's supposed to now. Even if my original playtime, I couldn't identify any of those effects because I never had them in the first place. One issue that I wanted to highlight that I don't know the cause of it because it's so weird is the pistol in the multiplayer fires at the wrong rate. Well, it's a combination of the fire speed, and we're talking split seconds worth, but the difference in the fire speed plus the reload time, if you just hold down the trigger in the Master Chief Collection compared to the Xbox, and this is only in multiplayer for some reason, gets out of sync. So by the time you fire like all 5 clips, the Xbox copy is way ahead of everyone else. And this obviously affects the multiplayer balance. And there's a lot of more nitpicky details that people have with the multiplayer that goes into it. But that's just one thing that stands out that I don't know if it's a frame rate interpolation because the game's literally running at a different speed, because there's been issues with the spread of the pistol with regards to that before. But it's one of those things that, to at least satisfy the purists, they are still going to have to keep tweaking.
Yeah, that is a strange one, and I do wonder why it happens. Does it not really happen with any of the other weapons?
No, as far as I can tell, it is purely the pistol, and you can actually counteract it if you hit reload. It's almost like the timing of the reload isn't right, because if you hit reload as soon as your last shoot fires, you can pretty much sync it back up. But the auto just holding it down is out of sync. So there's a timing or something that just needs slightly tweaked. That is probably an easy fix unless it is tied to like the game speed.
That is so odd. But I guess now the pistol is even less overpowered as a result. So
maybe it's intentional.
Yeah, maybe that is intentional. Maybe it is. There's a couple things we couldn't check out as a part of this because it was part of the preview. There were some things that I've always been curious about, like how the water on the horizon looks on the Halo level, or even on Silent Cartographer, or some of the Pelican textures in the game. We can't really check these out due to the preview version here, but I imagine based upon what we're seeing, a number of these will be changed, and those that aren't, well, I'll probably post about them on Twitter. But Adam, I really loved talking to you about Halo, one of my favorite games, and I'm very grateful that you helped us out for this video.
Likewise, thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun to go through these and actually have an excuse to sit down and do the A/B comparisons that I'm always curious about, and it's awesome.
Yeah, and also thanks to Halo Tupolev, or H. Tupolev, who provided a couple of the original Halo Combat Evolved kind of original recordings here that we did the lineups with. He helped me back then for my Halo CE video, and we just ended up reusing those here because I have them on our archive. But that's enough for us in this video today. If you did enjoy this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, then hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video.
And go to digitalfoundry.net for the Patreon.
Yes, exactly. He knows this spiel. And after that, follow us all on Twitter. Every single one of us.
Woo.
And this is Alex.
And this is Adam.
Bidding you farewell.
Bye.
Und